Margaret never called me her daughter-in-law. Not once. Not during the wedding. Not during the holidays. Not even after Ethan and I had been married for almost 2 years. To everyone else, she sounded perfectly polite. Elegant, even. The kind of woman people described as graceful and well put together. She always wore neutral-colored sweaters, pearl earrings, and perfume so soft you only noticed it after she walked past. But there was always distance in the way she spoke to me. A carefulness. As if she had built an invisible wall between us long before I ever entered her life. At family dinners, she would say things like, "Ethan and Lily are coming tonight." Or, "I made extra dessert in case Lily wants some." Never. My son and daughter-in-law. Never. Our family. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. After all, Margaret was never cruel. That almost made it worse. If she had openly disliked me, at least I would have known where I stood. Instead, she existed in this impossible middle ground. Kind enough to confuse me, distant enough to hurt me. And every time I tried to get closer to her, I somehow ended up feeling smaller. The first time I met Margaret was 6 months before the wedding. Ethan drove us to his parents' home in Connecticut on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I remember sitting in the passenger seat twisting my fingers together, while checking my reflection in the mirror every few minutes. "You're nervous for no reason," Ethan had laughed. "I just want your mom to like me. She'll like you." But when Margaret opened the front door that day, her expression barely changed. She looked at me calmly. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just carefully. "So," she said softly, "you're Lily." Not, "It's so nice to meet you." Not, "Welcome." Just, "You're Lily." I smiled awkwardly and held out the bottle of wine I had brought. "I didn't know what kind you liked, so." "Oh, you didn't need to do that," she interrupted gently, already turning toward the kitchen. The entire afternoon felt like trying to walk across ice without slipping. Margaret asked polite questions. Where did I grow up? What did my parents do? How long had I worked at the publishing company? But every answer seemed to disappear into the room without landing anywhere meaningful. Meanwhile, Ethan's father talked enough for everyone. Robert was loud, charming, impossible not to like. He teased Ethan constantly and laughed at his own jokes before anyone else could. Margaret mostly stayed quiet beside him, occasionally refilling someone's water glass before they noticed it was empty. I remember watching her hands that day. Steady, precise, controlled. Everything about Margaret felt controlled. When Ethan stepped out to take a phone call, I offered to help her in the kitchen. "You don't have to," she said immediately. "I don't mind." She hesitated for half a second before handing me a towel to dry dishes. For several minutes, we worked in silence. I kept trying to think of something to say. Something that would make her open up. "You have a beautiful home," I offered. "Thank you. I love the garden outside. My husband takes care of it." Silence again. Then finally, I asked the question I had been holding all afternoon. "Ethan says you used to teach piano?" Something flickered across her face. Quickly gone. "I did," she replied. "You stopped?" "Yes." That was it. No explanation. No story. Nothing. And standing there beside her in that spotless kitchen, I remember feeling something strange for the first time. Not rejection exactly. Something colder. Like I was standing outside a locked room, knocking politely while pretending not to notice nobody intended to open the door. The months leading up to the wedding didn't make things easier. Margaret helped with everything. The flowers. The seating charts. The catering disaster 2 weeks before the ceremony. She handled every problem calmly and efficiently. But emotionally, she remained untouchable. When I found my wedding dress, my own mother cried in the boutique. Margaret simply nodded once and said, "It fits you nicely." I spent hours afterward wondering if that was approval. One night, a few weeks before the wedding, Ethan found me sitting on our apartment floor surrounded by invitation samples. "You okay?" I looked up at him. "Does your mom not like me?" He sighed immediately, like he'd heard the question too many times already. "Lily, I'm serious. She likes you." "Then why does it always feel like she's holding me at arm's length?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck before sitting beside me. That's just how she is. I hated that answer. Because it explained everything and nothing at the same time. But she's warm with your dad, I said quietly. And with you. She's known us her whole life. The words settled heavily between us. As if maybe that was the problem. Maybe Margaret simply didn't know how to let new people into her world. Or maybe she didn't want to. Our wedding day arrived bright and cold in early October. The ceremony took place at a small stone church covered in ivy. The trees outside had just begun turning gold and red, and for a few perfect hours, everything felt beautiful enough to silence my doubts. Margaret wore navy blue. Simple. Elegant. Timeless. While my mother cried through nearly the entire ceremony, Margaret sat perfectly composed in the front row beside Robert, watching quietly. Always quietly. At the reception, people danced and drank champagne beneath hanging lights while jazz music floated through the hall. I remember laughing with friends near the bar when I overheard someone speaking behind me. Margaret. She must be so happy to finally have a daughter-in-law, one of Ethan's aunts said warmly. I turned instinctively, waiting to hear Margaret's response. There was a brief pause. Then Margaret smiled politely and said, "Lily makes Ethan very happy." That was all. Not, "Yes, I'm happy." Not, "She's wonderful." Just, "Lily makes Ethan very happy." I don't know why those words stayed with me so long. Maybe because even on my wedding day, Margaret found a way to make me feel like I existed only in relation to her son. Not as someone she loved herself, but as someone connected to someone she loved. And somehow, that hurt more than open dislike ever could. That night, after the reception ended and Ethan and I finally returned to the hotel, he wrapped his arms around me while I stood removing pins from my hair in front of the mirror. "You were beautiful today," he murmured against my shoulder. I smiled faintly. Then before I could stop myself, I asked, "Do you think your mom will ever love me?" Ethan looked surprised. "Of course she will." "Someday," I whispered. But deep down, I already feared the truth. Margaret might spend the rest of her life being kind to me, without ever truly letting me belong. The miscarriage happened on a Tuesday in March. Cold rain tapped softly against the hospital windows while I stared at the pale ceiling above me, feeling like my entire body had turned numb from the inside out. The doctor was still speaking. Words like, "I'm sorry. These things happen. There was nothing you could have done." But none of it sounded real anymore, because all I could hear was silence. The kind of silence that comes after something disappears forever. Ethan sat beside my hospital bed with both hands clasped tightly together, staring at the floor. He looked devastated, shocked, lost. But even then, I noticed something familiar in the way he handled pain. He withdrew from it. Like if he stayed still enough, quiet enough, maybe grief wouldn't fully reach him. When we got home later that evening, the apartment felt different immediately. Too clean. Too quiet. The small yellow nursery catalog still sat on the kitchen counter, where I had left it 2 days earlier. A tiny pair of baby socks rested beside it. I stared at them for almost a full minute before walking past. Ethan loosened his tie slowly. "You should try to rest," he murmured. I nodded even though I knew sleep wasn't coming. For the next few days, people called constantly. Friends. Co-workers. My mother. Flowers arrived at the apartment with sympathy cards written in soft handwriting. "Thinking of you. Sending prayers. So sorry for your loss." I thanked everyone politely, then cried the moment the calls ended. Margaret sent flowers too. White lilies. No note. That somehow hurt more than if she had written nothing at all. Because I stared at those flowers for hours trying to figure out what they meant. Was it kindness? Obligation? Pity? With Margaret, I never knew. After the first week, the world slowly returned to normal for everyone else. But not for me. Grief doesn't leave dramatically. It settles into the corners of your life quietly. In the mornings, I would wake up for half a second forgetting what happened. Then remember all over again. Like falling through ice. Again. And again. Ethan started working longer hours. At first, I told myself it made sense. He was grieving too. People handle pain differently. But little by little, our apartment became a place where sadness sat between us untouched. Like furniture neither of us acknowledged anymore. One night, I stood in the kitchen staring blankly at the microwave clock when Ethan walked in after 9. "You haven't eaten?" he asked gently. I shrugged. "I forgot." His expression tightened briefly. "You can't do that." I almost laughed at the absurdity of the sentence. As if forgetting to eat was somehow the problem. Ethan walked toward me slowly. "You need to start trying to move forward, Lily." Move forward. The words hit me so hard I physically stepped back. "What?" He sighed immediately. "That's not what I meant." "No. Y whisperat. I think it is." He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "I don't know how to fix this." Something inside me cracked quietly then, because I finally understood the difference between us. I wasn't trying to fix the grief. I was drowning inside it. And Ethan was desperately trying to escape it. After that conversation, things between us changed. Not dramatically. Worse. Subtly. We became careful with each other. Polite. Like two people sharing space beside a wound neither knew how to touch. Then came the night everything collapsed. It was raining again. I remember that clearly. I had spent the entire day alone in the apartment, unable to stop crying for reasons I couldn't even explain anymore. By evening, my chest felt tight and heavy, like breathing itself required effort. I stood up too quickly while walking toward the bathroom. The next thing I remember was the floor rushing toward me. Then darkness. When I woke up, fluorescent hospital lights blurred above me. Voices moved somewhere nearby. A machine beeped steadily beside the bed. For a few confused seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then slowly, everything returned. The miscarriage. The grief. The apartment. The emptiness. A nurse noticed my eyes open. "Oh good," she said softly. "You fainted from exhaustion and dehydration." I blinked slowly. "How long?" "Couple of hours." I turned my head slightly, expecting to see Ethan. But the chair beside my bed wasn't empty. Margaret sat there asleep, still wearing her camel-colored coat, one hand resting loosely against the armrest. A folder of hospital paperwork balanced in her lap. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was hallucinating. She sat here quietly. The overhead light softened the sharpness of her usual expression. Without it, she looked older somehow. More tired. Human. A nurse lowered her voice slightly. She wouldn't leave. Something tightened painfully in my chest. I looked back at Margaret. Even asleep, her posture remained composed, like she had trained herself never to fully let go. The movement of my blanket must have woken her. Her eyes opened immediately, alert within seconds. "Oh," she said softly when she saw me awake. Then after a brief pause, "You scared us." "Not. How are you feeling?" "Not. I was worried." "Just, you scared us." And somehow, that hurt my heart in an entirely different way, because beneath the controlled words, I heard something else. Fear. Margaret stood slowly. "The doctor said you need proper rest," she said. "And actual food." I almost smiled weakly at how practical she sounded. "Okay." She adjusted the hospital paperwork carefully before asking, "Have you eaten anything today?" I hesitated. "I don't remember." Something flickered across her face. Pain. Quickly hidden. She nodded once. I figured. Then silence settled between us again. But this silence felt different from before. Not cold. Just unfamiliar. Margaret glanced toward the rain outside the hospital window. "It was raining the night I had Ethan too," she said quietly. The sentence surprised me so much I looked up immediately. She almost never volunteered personal information. "You remember that?" I asked softly. A faint smile touched her lips. "I remember everything about my children." Children. Plural. I noticed it immediately. But before I could ask what she meant, the doctor entered the room. The conversation disappeared. Just like that. Later that night, after Ethan finally arrived from work looking pale and exhausted, Margaret quietly gathered her things to leave. "You don't have to go," I heard myself say unexpectedly. She paused. Only for a second. Then, "Your husband is here now." Formal again. Controlled again. But before walking out the door, she stopped beside my bed. Her fingers adjusted the edge of my blanket slightly. Such a small gesture. So small most people wouldn't notice it. But I did. Because it was the first time Margaret had touched me with something that felt unmistakably gentle. She looked down at me for a long moment. Then said quietly, "You need to stop apologizing for being in pain." My throat tightened instantly. Because I hadn't even realized I'd been doing that. And before I could respond, Margaret walked out of the room, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume, and the strange, unsettling feeling that maybe I had misunderstood her all along. After the hospital, something changed between Margaret and me. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. If you looked at us from the outside, everything probably seemed exactly the same. She still spoke softly. Still kept her emotions carefully folded away behind calm expressions and practical conversations. And she still never called me her daughter-in-law. But now, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Small things. The kinds of things you only see once you stop looking for grand gestures. 3 days after I came home from the hospital, someone knocked quietly on our apartment door around 7 in the morning. I opened it wearing Ethan's oversized sweatshirt, exhausted and confused. Margaret stood there holding 2 grocery bags. "I was nearby," she said. It was obviously a lie. She lived nearly 40 minutes away. Before I could respond, she stepped inside and walked directly into the kitchen like she already knew where everything belonged. "I bought soup," she said calmly. "An actual food that requires effort to chew." I blinked. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes," she replied while unpacking vegetables. "I did." The sentence caught me off guard. Not because of the words. Because of the certainty behind them. Margaret moved through the kitchen quietly, placing things into cabinets while I stood there watching her. "You can sit down," she said without turning around. "I'm okay." "You look pale." "That's kind of unavoidable right now." For a second, I thought I saw the corner of her mouth twitch slightly. Almost a smile. Almost. I sat at the kitchen table while she cooked. The apartment filled with the smell of garlic and rosemary. Warm and comforting in a way the silence hadn't been for weeks. Neither of us talked much. But strangely, it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. At one point, she opened the refrigerator and frowned slightly. "You have nothing in here. We've been ordering food." Margaret shut the refrigerator door slowly. "That's not food," she muttered. Again, almost making me smile. When the soup was finished, she placed a bowl in front of me and sat across from me at the table. "Eat." I obeyed mostly because arguing with her felt impossible. For several minutes, the only sound in the apartment was the soft clink of my spoon against the bowl. Then quietly, without looking at me, Margaret asked, "Are you sleeping at all?" The question surprised me. A little. "That means no." I stared down into the soup. "I close my eyes," I admitted softly. "But then I start thinking." Margaret nodded once like she already understood exactly what I meant. After a long silence, she said something unexpected. "When I was younger, people used to say grief comes in stages." I looked up immediately. She was still staring at her tea. "I always hated that expression," she continued calmly. "It makes pain sound organized." Something tightened in my chest. "Pain isn't organized," she said quietly. "It's random." The room went still. Because for the first time since I'd known her, Margaret wasn't speaking carefully anymore. She sounded like someone remembering something. Something old. Something heavy. I swallowed slowly. "How do you know?" The moment the question left my mouth, I regretted it. Margaret's fingers stilled against her teacup. For a second, I thought she might ignore me entirely. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, and finally said the words that explained everything. "I had a daughter before Ethan." My breath caught. The apartment suddenly felt completely silent. "You what?" Margaret's expression didn't change much. But her eyes did. They looked farther away now. "She died 3 days after she was born." I stared at her, unable to speak. In all the years Ethan and I had been together, he had never mentioned a sister. Not once. Margaret gave a faint shrug, almost uncomfortable beneath my shock. "It was a long time ago." "What was her name?" I asked softly. A long pause followed. Then, "Clara." The name landed gently between us. Real. Human. Loved. I felt tears sting my eyes almost instantly. Oh my God. Margaret looked down at her hands. She was early, she said quietly. Very small. Her voice remained calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that only comes from surviving something unbearable long enough that grief hardens into routine. Back then, she continued, people didn't talk about those things much. I listened silently. They told me to move on quickly. A faint bitter smile crossed her face, as if grief had a schedule. The room felt smaller now somehow. Closer. All this time, I had spent years trying to understand why Margaret kept everyone at a distance. And suddenly, I did. Not completely, but enough. You were afraid. I whispered before I could stop myself. Margaret looked at me then. Really looked at me. And for the first time since I met her, I saw something unguarded in her expression. Yes, she admitted softly. The honesty of it nearly broke my heart. I loved her so much, she continued. And then she was gone. Silence settled over us again. But this silence felt sacred somehow. Not empty. Not cold. Full of things neither of us knew how to hold properly. Margaret looked toward the kitchen window. For a long time after Clara died, she said quietly, I became very careful about loving people too openly. I felt my throat tighten. Because suddenly every confusing interaction from the past 2 years rearranged itself inside my mind. The distance. The control. The restraint. It had never been rejection. It had been fear. Margaret folded her hands together lightly. When Ethan brought you home for the first time, she admitted, I liked you immediately. I blinked in surprise. You did. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. And that frightened me more than I expected. Emotion rose painfully into my chest. Why? Margaret's eyes softened slightly. Because loving people means surviving the possibility of losing them. I looked away quickly before she could see the tears gathering in my eyes. For years, I had mistaken her distance for indifference. But sitting across from her now, I realized something devastating. Margaret had never been emotionally cold. She had simply loved through protection instead of expression. Quietly, carefully. From a distance she hoped would hurt less if loss ever came again. The thought shattered something inside me. Because suddenly I remembered every small thing she had ever done. The way she always packed leftovers for us after dinner. The birthday cards written in perfectly neat handwriting. The extra blanket she placed over my legs one Christmas when she thought I was asleep on the couch. None of it had been accidental. Margaret stood slowly and carried her teacup toward the sink. Before turning on the water, she spoke again. Very softly. I was afraid if I loved you too much, she said. I might lose you too. The tears finally slipped down my face. Because it was the closest thing to love she had ever said to me. And somehow, it meant more than if she had simply called me family from the beginning. After that morning in the kitchen, Margaret and I began orbiting each other differently. Not closer exactly. Closer implied ease. And neither of us knew how to do ease. But the distance between us softened. She started calling more often. Not emotional calls, never that. Practical ones. Have you eaten today? The weather's getting colder. Bea prupekuat. I left something outside your apartment building. That something was usually food. Soup. Bread. Tea she insisted helped with sleep. Once, it was simply a heating pad and a handwritten note that said, back pain gets worse when grief settles in your shoulders. No signature. As if I wouldn't recognize her careful handwriting immediately. Meanwhile, Ethan and I were slowly becoming strangers inside the same apartment. Not because we fought constantly. Honestly, I almost wished we did. At least anger would have meant something was still alive between us. Instead, everything became quiet. Controlled. Careful. Exactly the way Margaret used to be. Only now I understood how dangerous that kind of silence could become. Ethan stayed late at work more often. When he came home, he looked exhausted before the conversation even started. One evening, I found him sitting at the kitchen counter answering emails while eating leftover pasta straight from the container. You could at least heat it up, I said softly. He barely looked up. I've fine. The words echoed through me strangely. I'm fine. We had both become experts at saying things that weren't true. I sat across from him quietly. You missed the doctor's appointment today. His typing stopped for half a second. I know. You said you'd come. I had a meeting I couldn't cancel. I stared at him. This was important too. Ethan exhaled heavily and closed his laptop. I said I'm sorry. But you're not really here, Ethan. His jaw tightened instantly. What does that mean? It means every time things get hard, you disappear. The moment the sentence left my mouth, the room changed. Not loudly. Subtly. Like something fragile had cracked beneath us. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. I'm trying my best. I know. No, he said sharply, frustration finally surfacing. I don't think you do. Silence filled the kitchen. Then he laughed once. Short. Bitter. Do you think this has been easy for me? I blinked. I never said that. You act like I'm abandoning you. You are. The word slipped out before I could soften it. And immediately, Ethan looked wounded. Not angry. Worse. Defensive. Like someone being blamed for drowning while they were struggling to breathe too. I don't know what you want from me anymore, he admitted quietly. The honesty of it hurt. Because I wasn't entirely sure I knew either. I just knew I felt unbearably alone. That night, Ethan fell asleep on the couch. Not after a dramatic fight. Not after shouting. Just exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion settling between us like fog. I stood in the hallway staring at him for a long moment. Then quietly walked back into the bedroom alone. The next morning Margaret called. I almost didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to talk to her. Because I was embarrassed. Embarrassed that somehow the person who understood my grief best wasn't my husband. Lily. Her voice was calm as always. Yes. A brief pause. You sound tired. I laughed softly despite myself. That obvious? Yes. Something about her directness made it impossible to lie. I think Ethan and I are struggling, I admitted quietly. Margaret didn't respond immediately. I expected her to defend him. Most mothers would. Instead, she asked, has he been avoiding conversations? The accuracy stunned me. Yes. A long silence followed. Then Margaret sighed softly. He does that. There was something heavy in her voice now. Familiar. Resigned. As if this wasn't the first time she'd watched Ethan run from difficult emotions. He gets that from Robert, she added quietly. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. You noticed it too? Lily, she said gently. Mothers notice everything. The sentence settled deep in my chest. Because suddenly I wondered how much Margaret had seen all these years without saying anything. That weekend, Margaret invited us to dinner. Ethan almost declined because of work. Margaret shut that down immediately. You can survive one evening away from your emails. Even Ethan looked mildly shocked by the firmness in her tone. Dinner itself started normally enough. Robert talked through most of the meal. Margaret served roasted chicken and potatoes while Ethan scrolled through his phone beside his plate whenever he thought nobody noticed. Margaret noticed. Of course she did. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself quietly and stepped onto the back porch for air. The autumn wind was cold against my face. I wrapped my sweater tighter around myself and stared out at the dark backyard. A few minutes later, the porch door opened behind me. Margaret stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to me silently. Thank you. We stood beside each other quietly for a while. Then she said, you look unhappy. Straightforward. Precise. I swallowed hard. I think we both are. Margaret nodded slightly like that answer made perfect sense. Inside the house, I could faintly hear Robert laughing at something on television. Ethan's voice answered, distracted and distant. Margaret stared out into the darkness. When Clara died, she said quietly, Robert went back to work 3 days later. I turned toward her slowly. He said staying busy helped him cope. The wind moved softly through the trees. And did it? Margaret's expression barely changed. For him? Probably. The ache in her voice was almost invisible, but devastating once noticed. I spent months feeling completely alone beside someone who claimed to love me. The words hit so close to my own pain that my throat tightened instantly. Margaret looked at me then. Directly. For some people, she said softly, providing feels easier than grieving. I thought of Ethan working late every night, avoiding conversations, avoiding eye contact whenever I cried. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He simply didn't know how to stay emotionally present inside pain. Just like his father never had. The porch door suddenly opened again. Ethan stepped outside looking tense. There you are. His eyes moved between Margaret and me. Something unreadable crossed his face then. Almost confusion. As if seeing his wife and mother emotionally connected felt unnatural somehow. You okay? He asked me. Before I could answer, Margaret spoke first. She's lonely. The bluntness stunned all of us. Ethan blinked. What? Margaret turned toward him fully now. And for the first time since I'd known her, her composure cracked. Not dramatically, but enough. She lost a child, Ethan. His expression tightened immediately. I know that. No, Margaret said quietly. You know it happened. That's not the same thing. The air between them went still. I had never seen Margaret confront her son before. Ever. Ethan looked blindsided. I'm trying. You're hiding. His jaw clenched. That's not fair. Margaret's voice softened then, which somehow made the moment even more painful. Being a good provider is not the same as being emotionally present. Silence. Heavy and immediate. Ethan looked away first. Like the truth physically hurt to hear. And standing there between them, I suddenly realized something I never expected. Margaret wasn't protecting her son. She was protecting me. The realization broke something open inside my chest. Because all this time, I had spent years believing Margaret kept me at a distance because I wasn't fully family. But now I understood. Margaret had already accepted me as family long ago. I just hadn't recognized the shape her love took. Before walking back inside, she touched my arm lightly. Just once. Then quietly said, You deserve to be loved out loud, Lily. And for the first time since my miscarriage, I cried without trying to hide it. Winter arrived quietly that year. Not with heavy snowstorms or dramatic winds. Just cold mornings, pale skies, and the kind of silence that settles gently over everything after a long season of pain. By December, Ethan and I had started therapy. Not because things were magically fixed. Because we had finally admitted they weren't. The first session was awkward. Painfully awkward. We sat on opposite ends of the couch while the therapist asked questions neither of us seemed prepared to answer honestly. How have you both been coping with the loss? Ethan immediately looked down. I stared at my hands. The silence stretched so long the therapist finally said softly, You don't have to protect each other from the truth in here. That sentence changed something. Slowly. Painfully. But honestly. For the first time in months, Ethan started speaking instead of escaping. He admitted he felt helpless every time I cried. Admitted he buried himself in work, because fixing spreadsheets felt easier than facing emotions he couldn't control. And for the first time, I admitted something too. I stopped feeling emotionally safe with you. I whispered one afternoon during therapy. The words visibly shattered him. But they were true. Healing didn't happen all at once after that. Some nights we still sat in silence. Some conversations still ended in frustration. But now we stayed in the room instead of running from it. And somehow that mattered. Margaret never asked directly about therapy, but she always seemed to know when we'd had a difficult session. On those evenings, soup mysteriously appeared at our apartment. Or tea. Or little practical things she pretended weren't emotional gestures. One afternoon, I opened the front door to find a thick knitted scarf folded neatly beside a paper bag. Inside the bag were fresh cinnamon rolls. No note. But tucked beneath the scarf was a receipt from a bakery nearly an hour away. I laughed softly to myself. Margaret loved quietly. But she loved thoroughly. By Thanksgiving, things between Ethan and me still felt fragile. Not broken. Just rebuilding. Like two people learning how to hold something carefully after almost dropping it forever. Margaret hosted dinner that year. The house smelled like rosemary, butter, and cinnamon before we even stepped inside. Robert greeted us loudly from the living room while football played on television. "You two are late," he announced dramatically. "We're 7 minutes late," Ethan replied. "In my generation, that's late." For the first time in a long while, I laughed easily. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. And instinctively, my body prepared for the old familiar distance. The polite smile. The emotional carefulness. But instead, she walked directly toward me. "You're freezing," she said immediately. Before I could answer, she adjusted the collar of my coat gently like it was the most natural thing in the world. Such a small gesture. But it stunned me anyway. The dining room slowly filled as relatives arrived. Aunts, cousins, neighbors who had somehow become honorary family over the years. The house buzzed with warmth and overlapping conversations. At one point, while helping Margaret in the kitchen, I noticed something strange. I wasn't nervous anymore. For years, every interaction with her had felt like a test I was silently failing. Now, standing beside her while she basted turkey and criticized Robert's inability to set a table properly, I felt something unfamiliar. Comfort. Margaret handed me a serving spoon. "Can you bring this out?" "Of course." As I turned toward the dining room, she stopped me softly. "Lily." I looked back. Her expression remained composed as always, but her eyes softened slightly. "You look healthier." The emotion that rose in my chest caught me completely off guard, because I realized something in that moment. Margaret had been watching me all along, caring all along. She just never knew how to say it loudly. Dinner began with the usual chaos of passing plates and overlapping conversations. Robert argued with Ethan about football. Someone accidentally spilled wine. An aunt complained about airline prices for nearly 15 minutes straight. For the first time in over a year, everything felt normal. Not perfect, but alive again. Halfway through dinner, Ethan reached for my hand beneath the table. Small, quiet, intentional. I squeezed back gently, and when I looked up, I caught Margaret noticing. She didn't smile. Margaret almost never smiled fully, but something peaceful crossed her face before she looked back down at her plate. Then came the moment I would remember for the rest of my life. One of Robert's sisters glanced around the room suddenly and asked, "So where's your daughter-in-law? I haven't seen her helping with dessert yet." The conversation around the table softened slightly. I looked up automatically. Margaret was pouring tea near the end of the table. For a second, she didn't answer. Then slowly, she lifted her eyes toward me. Our gazes met across the room, and something shifted quietly between us. Years of misunderstandings. Distance, fear, grief, love neither of us knew how to name properly. Then Margaret spoke. Softly, calmly, but clearly enough that the entire room heard her. "That's not my daughter-in-law." The table fell silent instantly. My breath caught. I stared at her, completely frozen. Margaret set the teapot down carefully, then looked directly at me again. And for the first time in all the years I had known her, her voice carried no distance at all. "That's my daughter." No one spoke. Not immediately, because the sentence landed too deeply, too honestly. Emotion rose into my chest so suddenly it almost hurt. I felt Ethan's hand tighten around mine beneath the table. Margaret held my gaze for one long quiet moment. And suddenly I understood everything she had spent years trying and failing to say. The soup deliveries, the hospital chair, the extra blankets, the practical phone calls, the silent protection, the careful love. It had all been love. Every single bit of it. Margaret cleared her throat softly and reached again for the teapot, almost uncomfortable with the emotion now hanging openly in the room. Robert blinked once before muttering, "Well, it's about time you admitted it." Laughter broke softly around the table. Gentle, warm, human. And for the first time since entering this family, I didn't feel like someone standing outside the door anymore. I belonged there. Not because I had earned perfection, not because I had finally become good enough, but because somewhere along the way, beneath all Margaret's fear and carefulness, she had already chosen me long ago. She just needed time to say it out loud.